Say it.
Gamer.
Field eyes.
The Star Wars prequels are bad. That's a fact of life at this point. Of course, there are people out there that make the case that these films have legitimate value. Usually these arguments take the form of advocating for the ironic entertainment factor of the movies. I'd agree with that side of things. These movies are hilarious, but I can't get on board with other claims that they are somehow misunderstood classics, or really that they're anything more than just an infinite source of memes. One of the most popular defenses I hear for this trilogy being unironically entertaining is that the action sequences and set pieces are actually really well done and engaging. I guess I could see that argument maybe working for Revenge of the Sith, but in the case of Episode 2, Attack of the Clones, straight up these are some of the worst action scenes I've ever seen.
I hate them!
I think the best way to illustrate just how whack these action and fight scenes are would be to go through each action sequence individually and break down the multiple ways in which each one fails to be in any way entertaining or well made from a technical standpoint. But before we look at the individual sequences, I should probably explain the strange way in which the Star Wars prequel trilogy was made. Here's the thing. George Lucas is obsessed with the technology aspect of filmmaking, specifically when it comes to visual effects. He always wants to be on the cutting edge of CGI and 3D animation, so much so that he updates his own movies with newer effects, even if they actively make the movies worse. There are plenty of filmmakers in this category. Robert Zemeckis, James Cameron, and Jon Favreau, another Star Wars guy actually, all come to mind. The effects work for the Star Wars movies is done by a branch of Lucasfilm called Industrial Light and Magic, or ILM. ILM is one of the most well-respected special effects houses in the world, having done some truly impressive things over the years. I'm talking stuff like their work on the original Star Wars trilogy, the T-1000 from Terminator 2, and of course the Adventures of Shark Boy and Lava Girl. In all seriousness, these guys have done a lot of groundbreaking stuff that pushed the entire industry forward. But the main point is that George Lucas is in love with the visual effects, and he founded and had full access to one of the best special effects companies in the entire world. Due to this fixation on visual effects, the prequels were not made in the same way that most movies are. Instead, these movies were shot almost entirely using blue and green screens. And when I say almost entirely, I'm talking whole sets covered head to toe with screens. And that means a couple of things. First, the actors clearly don't have a whole lot to work with, so in turn that means that the onus is on the director, your boy George in this case, to really do their job well and help these actors deal with the strange work environment. It also means there's not a ton of set construction and even less location shooting. The few on-location scenes that made the final cut of the Attack of the Clones are all exposition scenes. And so effectively, all of these action set pieces were shot at a 20th Century Fox studio space in Sydney, Australia, which, in this case, is just a digital purgatory made entirely of violently bright colored screens. You might be thinking this is a relatively standard procedure in the CGI-laden world of Hollywood over the past few decades, and you'd be right in thinking that too. The biggest movies in the world all feature plenty of green screen work, but there's a difference. If the script calls for a giant space whale getting one-shotted by a skyscraper-sized Paul Rudd, well then shit, you probably should fire up the visual effects software. George Lucas doesn't play like that though. My guy loves computer effects, so he said fuck it, whole trilogy shot on green screen. Dialogue scenes that could be shot on location or with a physical set? Nah, let's throw the actors in a room full of lime green nothing and see what we get. By my count, there are 6 major action sequences in Attack of the Clones. You could argue that there are technically more or less of these scenes. For instance, I see the pit fight and the subsequent Battle of Geonosis as one long sequence with multiple parts, but you could also look at that as 2 or 3 separate scenes. Either way, it doesn't really matter because it's all trash. But those 6 sequences are the chase through Coruscant, Jango vs. Obi-Wan on Kamino, the Slave 1 chase in the Asteroid Belt, the Droid Factory, the Geonosis Arena and subsequent battle, and George saved the goofiest for last with the fight with Count Dooku. Most of these are backloaded into the latter half of the runtime with only one action scene taking place before the 1 hour mark. That would be the speeder chase through the high-rises of Coruscant. Occurring roughly 15 minutes into the runtime, the first major action sequence of Attack of the Clones involves Obi-Wan and Anakin pursuing Zam, an assassin hired to kill Padme. This is a good setup for a chase sequence as it provides some built-in urgency to the scene, something which is necessary in order to create suspense. This is actually kind of a recurring pattern with all of these scenes, a setup that seems promising that is then executed in the lamest way possible. In terms of where this is all set to play out, I'd say that seems pretty promising at first glance too. Setting in particular has always been a strong suit of Star Wars, and you'd think that George Lucas would try to capitalize on that for the action sequences, what are supposed to be the energetic peaks of the movie. That's particularly true of this scene. The neon-lit, clearly Blade Runner-inspired airways of Coruscant seem like the perfect place for a fun action set piece. You would think that the setting alone should at least make the chase visually interesting, but somehow it doesn't. There was so much opportunity here to create something really appealing to the eye. A high-tech city bathed in thousands of different neon lights, or a gritty, grimy picture of an urban future. There are lots of ways they could have taken this. What the movie presents us with is something in between that fails to be anything other than drab. We don't really get to see much of the setting anyway, except for big blocks of the same boring buildings. Look at the urban, cyber world created in Blade Runner, the clear inspiration for Coruscant's look, and then compare that with what we get here. There really is no comparison. I get it, this scene really did require the use of the CGI, but knowing that, the filmmakers should have recognized that the visual style of the scene would have to carry it, and thus the scene might benefit from some more stylization. It goes back to that whole idea that parts of these movies are effectively animated films. I'd say the choice of color palette here is pretty baffling too. They went with steely grays for almost all of the buildings and a really basic coloring for the light sources as well. This is a sci-fi world, why not push the color choices into some less neutral territory? Like here, I get that they were going for an industrial look lit by these pillars of fire, but why not bathe the whole thing in a vibrant red or orange? Anything would be better than this disgusting brown they went with. Why is there so much ugly brown and tan in this movie? Don't forget, the movie's environments were practically solely made in a computer, so it's not like this wasn't a deliberate choice. The shot selection and composition don't really add a whole lot either. What we get here are two things. Shots of speeders flying past skyscrapers intercut with close shots of the heroes delivering cornball lines of dialogue. Both categories of shot are vanilla as hell, as there's no diversity in the angles or perspectives. Save that by-the-numbers stuff for exposition scenes where too much style can be distracting. The fast-paced action stuff is where the more inventive techniques should be used. I'm not saying that every action sequence has to be the most flowing and dynamic thing ever shot, but for the love of God, switch it up a little bit every once in a while. For example, when Anakin jumps onto Zam's speeder, some long shots for scale or some close-ups of hands struggling to find a grip would be an easy way of adding the smallest amount of tension and kinetics. It doesn't look like he's going to fall off because the illusion of motion doesn't work in this shot. A movie like Mission Impossible Rogue Nation, a much newer movie, I know, it's just an example, doesn't have this problem because Tom Cruise is actually hanging off of that plane. Here, the speeder is just a prop in front of a green screen, so in order to build suspense and get an emotional rise in the audience, you have to shoot it in a way that doesn't immediately break the illusion. Improved shot selection would go a long way here. The shots are almost all uniform in length as well. There's no change of pace in the editing whatsoever. The biggest problem is most likely how redundant the scene is as a whole. There is little to no progression as the scene goes on, and what I mean by that is that for the most part, the parameters of the chase stay the same the entire time. Except for at one point, this field of electricity that they pass through with no consequences anyway, so does it really even count? The scene never adds a new dynamic, it never raises the stake, and never really changes the surroundings, save for maybe the aforementioned jump to Zam's speeder. It's a boring journey from A to B during which we never are worried about the characters. Forget knowing that these are the prequels and that these two are guaranteed to live through this anyway. Even if you knew nothing about Star Wars, you would still feel no emotional investment because of the performances. Because it's the Star Wars prequels, it kinda goes without saying that the acting is laughably bad. It's the ultimate double-edged sword though. A lot of the times, the bad acting is the best part of the movie if you're looking at it ironically. But in the case of the action scenes, the bad acting is really detrimental to the purpose of those scenes. With the action scenes, the sole purpose of the acting is communicating emotion so that we feel something. So when Anakin's expressions and line deliveries are all completely relaxed and unbothered, it tells the audience that they should be too. You could say that that's because Anakin is one of the best and most natural pilots in the galaxy or whatever, and that makes sense for his character, but I'd call BS on that excuse. You can show a character as being both proficient and stressed at the same time. The scene would be so much more effective if Anakin was shown to be completely locked in focus-wise, while at the same time struggling to maintain that focus due to the crazy circumstances around him. I don't know, channeling the Force to clear his mind or something, kind of like Luke did during the Trench Run. And we would see through that,
wow, this guy must be pretty fucking nasty at flying. He remained cool and focused despite the immense amount of stress he was clearly facing.
Instead, what we get is this hollow, blazing confidence from Hayden Christensen the whole time that just does nothing. No struggle, no effort, and in turn, almost no energy to be found in this chase. And that's such a shame too. He showed a lot of promise in Goosebumps, the notorious proving ground for young Canadian acting talent in the 90s. I'm only going to incorporate plot and character issues with the film into these critiques when they lean towards the technical side as opposed to the lore and backstory angle. This is more of a look at the filmmaking itself. But in this case, the technical aspect I'm looking at is performance, which is always informed by plot and character, so it's unavoidable here. And that'll happen here and there. The sins committed on the narrative level by this trilogy have already been examined to death as it is. Alright, enough about the Coruscant chase. Let's take a look at the next major action scene.
Get on board!
The fight between Obi-Wan and Jango Fett on Kamino is typically thought of as one of the highlights of Episode 2. On a rewatch, this fight is complete cheeks. This is an hour into the movie. At this point, you're ready to see some shit go down. Especially back when you were a kid, sitting through all the sand talk and the introduction of legislature or whatever Jar Jar is supposed to be doing. I mean, as an adult, those are the best parts. God knows that it's not the action scenes, and especially not this one. Alright, here we go. It's finally time. The big fight between Jango and Obi-Wan. Alright, starting out a little simple here. Maybe some improv. Oh, and he's gone. What the hell? Barely anything happens before Jango hits the eject button and the whole thing turns into rope-a-dope, slip-and-slide goofball antics. The biggest mistake happens right here. Did you catch that? Yeah, there's a good idea. Immediately get rid of the one lightsaber in the scene. Let's take the coolest part of any Star Wars media, the thing that most people, whether they be big fans or just casual viewers, want to see the most. It's been an hour and this is what we've gotten up to this point. You're pumped when Obi-Wan fires that bad boy up. This is what you came to see. Like it or not, for the majority of people, this is what Star Wars is all about. So the disappointment hits different when you realize he only has the lightsaber for about 20 seconds of this already short, sub 3 minute long fight. The rationale for doing this must have been to limit Obi-Wan and make the fight scrappier or something. And that's all well and good, but they don't execute on that at all. When the two come together again after a video game cutscene of Jango shooting a rocket, the editing is choppy and all over the place to the point where the two are separated again before we even get a good look at anything that's going on. The majority of this scene is just Obi-Wan and Jango trying not to fall off of the side of the platform. This is really the best scenario George could come up with given these characters in this setting. I mentioned improv offhand earlier, but this does feel like they just made up the progression of the scene as they went along. This fight in particular sticks out to me as being the biggest wasted opportunity in Attack of the Clones. On paper, this should be another killer scene based on the setting alone. The slick landing platform standing high over a churning ocean in the driving rain of this forgotten planet serves as the perfect arena for staging a battle between two big characters. And even if you don't have full context for who these characters are, earlier scenes established, albeit through telling not showing, that Obi-Wan is a powerful warrior and Jango is a dangerous bounty hunter. And not to mention the way these characters look too. They have these cool designs that suggest interesting combat abilities, but when the action scenes come around, it's always a toss-up as to whether a character will be in God mode or putting on a clown show like Obi-Wan is here. And that's one of the movie's biggest flaws. It constantly reminds you through both dialogue and visuals that these characters are supposed to be very capable, only for them to consistently prove otherwise when it starts to go down. Why choose to nerf both characters and have them miss and mess up constantly, or take away the most interesting aspect of their character in combat? If anything, go the opposite direction and depict them as both being very powerful. But no, that would require some thought, whereas making them both scrubs is easily accomplished. Besides, we don't have the money to shoot an extended, in-depth action sequence. We still have to pay for the effects work for fucking Dexter Jettster's diner, which for some reason has to be fully CG. It's such a shame too, because I think they really could have done something cool visually here, but they chose to mute everything with these desaturated blues and grays. It's basically monotone, especially once the bright blue light from the saber is gone early on. Why is Attack of the Clones so scared of having any style or, God forbid, appealing color in its action scenes? And I want to reiterate that I don't think that every Star Wars action scene needs to pop like the throne room fight. I just want something that isn't straight up ugly. It's like these scenes are in a hurry to get over with so we can get back to more Watto. The Lego Star Wars version is legitimately a more fun experience than watching this scene. Just think about that. Search your feelings. You know it to be true. The next major action scene, the chase with the Slave 1 through the asteroid field, happens not too long after the Kamino fight. Seriously, the only thing separating the two is the Watto scene, which is like 4 minutes long. This one is pretty par for the course too in terms of Star Wars spaceflight scenes, and the asteroid belt is not a new scenario for the series. On its own, it's whatever, but it's probably the best in the movie. Yeah, at the very least, it's something interesting to look at visually, and I'm sure the sound of the explosions and the high-speed maneuvering was cool in the theater back in 2002. It's not boring, but it's nothing special, and normally that would be fine, as this would be one of the secondary set pieces in the grand scheme of the movie, with stronger, more exciting sequences on either side of it. That in itself is a pretty damning argument against this movie's action. In no world should this be the most entertaining action scene in any Star Wars movie. It's got its own minor problems too. The scene doesn't do itself any favors when it cuts away from the wide shots to the actors in the cockpits. Despite hating flying and throwing a fit earlier, Obi-Wan is calm the entire time. Like, his heart rate never changes, he just kind of handles everything. Are we talking about the same guy here? It's just inconsistent writing, not the biggest deal in the world. There are some laughably bad green screen shots with Jango in the foreground, and actually strangely, this is a rare Attack of the Clones scene without music backing it. My guess is this was done in service of those percussive bomb blasts I mentioned earlier. Deprive the scene of much needed energy for some cheap reactions in the theater. Interesting choice. The reason this one stands out as being the least awful is because its concept and setting are most well suited to an all CGI approach. George Lucas didn't stop to think if having everything be done digitally in any given scene was beneficial to that scene or not. Clearly, this chase needed to be done with CG, but that isn't the case for the rest of these. Making everything except for the actors and a spare prop or two in a computer leaves those actors in purgatory and leaves us viewers with another A to B forgettable scene. The Droid Factory scene is one of the worst scenes I've seen in a movie ever. It's hideous to look at, devoid of stakes or tension, and lazy beyond belief. It is trash of the highest order. Again, right from the start, you can see it's washed in those disgusting browns that, while yes, are part of this planet's aesthetic, could be implemented so much better. It doesn't matter how it's shot or edited because the scene is dead on arrival when its basic coloration is this gross. The digital artists claim they were going for a hellscape with this look, and I think they got it, just not in the way they wanted to. This could be what hell is, an ugly, near-homogeneous brown mess that has no character and no ambition. The factory with steam and sparks everywhere is already a cliche, so why not have fun with it? It's Star Wars, so why just stick with the typical conveyor belt and mechanical arms when you could throw some crazy stuff in there and get creative with the possibilities of a droid factory? They sort of do, but it's in the comic relief channel of the sequence with C-3PO, so it's not like that opened the door to any cool stunt work or encounter possibilities. Speaking of encounters, these flying Bugs Life looking dudes pose zero threat. Anakin's out here on combat training mode, jacking up his KD against bots. He never gets touched, he's just tearing through everyone. If that's what you're going for, then really lean into it. Show Anakin take down a horde of this fodder. Instead, it's just one or two guys here and there that Anakin brushes aside like mosquitoes. Fun. There's no consistency again, but what do you expect at this point? In this part, Padme dodges every hazard with no problem. She just breezes right through them. And then immediately after, she's just useless all of a sudden. Clearly agility and strength are two separate things, but you would think that after doing this, she would at least be able to put up some level of resistance. Why not give her a chance to take some of these fellas out before she gets put in the damsel of distress position? I mean, look at these shots. That's the best she can do? And oh yeah, she's all of a sudden a super capable, resourceful badass in the next scene. They were just too lazy to give her anything interesting to do in this one. The whole section with Anakin's arm being stuck in this thing and Padme about to get incinerated before R2 saves the day has no tension or suspense to it at all. Just cutting back and forth between the same shots of actors looking stressed is not going to cut it. We have no sense of scale or space because the shot never gets wide enough to get a real sense of layout. We need to see where the lava is relative to Padme so the shots showing us this bucket over and over have more meaning. The lack of tension falls on Padme being useless as well. If we saw her struggling to save herself, we would be more invested and might even feel some level of anxiety. But she kind of just pushes against the wall and makes no attempt to save her own life, almost like she doesn't care. So why should we? There has to be some sort of strain, some literal visual tension if we are going to feel anything while watching. There's no suspense, nothing cool to look at, and no cool or flashy fight or stunt choreography. Just a terrible scene, and there's a reason for that. The argument against the Droid Factory scene can be made pretty easily. Here's what producer Rick McCallum had to say about the scene's production.
The fantastic thing about it, we had a blue screen stage and a blue conveyor belt, and that was it. We shot the whole sequence in 4.5 hours with both Natalie and Hayden. We did it before lunch.
Following a rough cut screening, George believed that the movie really lagged towards the middle, and so he wanted to add a scene that's whole purpose was to be exciting. This was the solution to the movie not being exciting? Have Hayden Christensen and Natalie Portman traipse around on a blue conveyor belt for a few hours and then paint this disgusting environment around them? Genius. The guy practically brags about how they did the whole scene before lunch. Not something to be confident about, Chief. This is a $115 million production. There should be some actual effort put in here. I hate to beat a dead horse, but we all know where the budget went. Gotta get the shading just right on the
Darwalk
hologram. You know how long that takes. The first half of the Geonosis sequence is similar to the Jango and Obi-Wan fight in that it's a lot better both in your memory and on paper than it is in execution. How do you make a scene that has each of the three main heroes in one-on-ones with a space monster lame? You do exactly what Attack of the Clones did. Like usual, it starts out fine. The monster designs are threatening and varied, which should provide dozens of interesting possibilities for exciting fights. But George doesn't go for any of those. He does the same thing he always does, tease you with characters and creatures that seem cool outside of combat, but when it comes down to it, they don't actually do anything that's even remotely cool. Each fight basically boils down to the hero trying to avoid the monster until all of a sudden a switch is flipped and the script allows them to just kind of win. The monsters go from threatening and legitimately dangerous to just accepting death or domestication. How about some creative use of the Force or some actual problem solving instead of just random out of the blue resolutions? Was this scene from earlier supposed to justify that Anakin is some kind of animal whisperer and can just tame his monster? Wouldn't it make more sense to have the experienced and cerebral Obi-Wan manipulate his creature while Anakin, who is supposed to be direct and brutal, takes care of the
lightsaber
executions? Padme's got max lockpicking skills apparently all of a sudden and is totally competent again after the whole bucket episode. Case in point of the characters changing on a dime to suit the script.
She can't do that!
Yo, I agree with you, man. Big shock here, there's hardly any suspense to be found in the scene, and even when someone does get hurt, in this case it's Padme getting torn up, it's not like it changes anything. Padme is fine for the whole big-ass battle that's coming up, she's hardly even hurt apparently. Of course, you're not going to have her like screaming in agony as she bleeds out, these are ultimately movies aimed at families, but you're still going the action suspense route here. You at least have to put some energy into your movie. I agree that the movies are trying to be goofy and that they aren't supposed to be taken completely seriously. The cheese factor has always been high in Star Wars, and I think that's a good thing, but at the same time, I don't think that's a good defense for these ho-hum action sequences. You can be exciting, suspenseful, and even a little bit brutal while still maintaining the fun that Star Wars has at its core. And ultimately, that's like my biggest criticism here. The scenes just aren't any fun, and that's a crime based on the setup for all of them. They just exist to fill a role in a plot chart.
This isn't how it's supposed to be.
John Williams must be big time sore from carrying these movies on his back. His score is used almost constantly. I mean that literally. There are very few times in these movies where music isn't being played. I mean, his shit slaps, of course, it's John Williams, but in the grand scheme of things, the score is just such a massive crutch here. It's like the movie's last-ditch attempt to try to get you to feel something while watching these boring scenes. The only consistent thing in this movie is how every scene is made worse by the choice to do fully digital sets and backgrounds. This was a great opportunity to build an impressive arena set for the actors to work in while filling in the bustling crowd in the background with CG to maintain that big sense of scale they were going for. It would be completely feasible too. Just a few years earlier, the Gladiator production team literally built a replica of 1/3 of the Roman Colosseum. That was never George's intention though. He wanted to make a 3D animated film with live action characters. And the result is shots like this one. I mean, come on, this looks about as good as the parody from Ned's Declassified. The second half of the sequence is supposed to be the big Clone War battle that starts with the heroes being surrounded by the droid army until the Jedis pull up to save the day. Again, how do you screw something like this up? Easy, I guess. You just fill it full of mindless shots of Jedis twirling around lightsabers and kicking the shit out of the weakest, least threatening enemies ever.
Droids suck.
They are useless. They are just there to be cut down. I mean, mindless really is the word. There's no goal within the scene. The characters aren't racing against the clock. They aren't looking for anything. They're just there doing lightsaber practice in a dusty tan circle. Fascinating stuff. They managed to make lightsabers, one of the coolest things ever, seem completely pedestrian. It's most likely all improv too. I mean, choreography be damned here. This continues after the characters are rescued too, as we get what feels like just endless, fully CGI shots of explosions and troops. And sure, having that much going on the screen was probably pretty impressive in 2002, but you just can't help but think how much better it would look if some of what you were seeing was actually there in front of the camera. This approach of depicting a battle through endless, nearly mindless combat and violence can be effective in stuff like Saving Private Ryan and later on Game of Thrones, but that's because those two are able to go for savage violence, which is striking enough on its own to get an emotional response. Star Wars can't do that, and so therefore this type of stuff is probably just going to wash over the viewer and ultimately be forgotten. If you look at the big battle sequence in The Two Towers, a movie that released the exact same year as Attack of the Clones, you quickly see how bad and more importantly how boring the Battle of Geonosis is compared to something like the Battle of Helm's Deep. I could go down the list and compare every aspect from these two sequences. From the look, I mean this is what I mean when I say visual style, this is a gorgeous battle scene, to the choreography and stunts, to the editing and so on and so on. It's all better in Lord of the Rings. Even the music, which is actually really saying something. You really should watch these scenes back to back to get a sense of what I'm talking about in this video. The Two Towers had a smaller budget than Attack of the Clones 2, so the blame here is yet again on George Lucas and his all CGI approach as the director. The last action scene in the movie is the infamous fight with Count Dooku. Let's address the elephant in the room right away. This is the scene that has Yoda flipping around and making old man grunts. We've all heard the outcries against it. We all know that this is next level goofball territory. I don't need to harp on this too much more. Listen, the lore of Star Wars isn't that important to me, so I really don't feel that offended by the scene. But if I'm looking at this with a critical lens, I can't ignore that it's just another case of characters not being consistent. So yeah, it's dumb, but so is the rest of the scene. It pulls everyone's favorite trick, almost immediately removing the power of the characters. Yet again, rather than allowing the characters to excel and show real power or skill, they just get nerfed and are forced to scramble around for the whole scene. It's just lazy. The only reason they don't nerf Yoda is because he's all CG, so the effort is put in by the effects team, not the director, who, would actually have to do his job and block out a scene and work with his actors. I mean, come on, this is supposed to be like the big confrontation in the movie. If there's one thing to not half-ass, it's probably this. And people are expecting something big after the last fight in the Phantom Menace, which is an example of a great 2-on-1 that later turns into a 1-on-1. The same setup is basically in place here, but instead of this, We get pretend Yoda and Christopher Lee gesturing and making faces at each other before 2 minutes of this nonsense, and then Dooku just dips. The dialogue and acting are terrible too, of course. I mean, Christopher Lee tries at least, but even a master like him can't make this filth work. Compare this mid-fight dialogue with anything from the original trilogy. It doesn't even come close. There's almost nothing more to say because hardly anything happens. There's no movement. It all takes place in this one boring room. Even from a narrative level, the scene does almost nothing except for cut off Anakin's hand, which does not really matter at the end of the day if you think about what happens to him. The other action scenes felt like boring taxi rides in between dialogue scenes that just kind of move the story along. And this scene can't even accomplish that. It just feels like a waste of time. I guess all the action in this movie is a waste of time. Maybe even the whole movie itself is a waste of time. With the other two in the trilogy, they at least feel like the beginning and end of Anakin's story, but this one just feels like the gray nothingness in between for the sake of having an entire trilogy. Star Wars doesn't need to be high art or anything, but it should at least be fun and have some thrilling action. Attack of the Clones can't even muster that. And having said all of that, I would still much rather watch it than Rise of Skywalker.